So I'm hoping that you can watch this video and match up the noise that you're having in your car to the noise that I'm having in my car, and you can at least confirm that you have a bad wheel bearing. This video will explain quickly and professionally how to identify common bad wheel bearing sounds. Stick around to learn typical symptoms and how to easily locate your bad wheel bearing. Wheel bearings typically sound grindy, growly. When a bearing starts to go bad, it makes noise, and typically that noise is described as grinding, growling, whining. It's almost like sticking a playing card in the spokes of a bicycle and then spinning the wheel really fast. That's a type of noise it kind of makes. The second stage, typically it'll start to get loose. Now you should be able to see that. That's quite pronounced wheel bearing movement. That is a loose wheel bearing. In the third stage, it just doesn't turn anymore, and that's where you can get into catastrophic failure. Where the wheel can separate from the knuckle and cause you to veer off the road, or the wheel could just completely separate from the car. Typically when I test drive and I'm checking for a wheel bearing, it can be hard to determine where it is, so I split the system. I want to split it left to right or front to rear. So when I did drive this, I could tell that it was in the rear. I couldn't tell which side it was, but I could definitely tell it was in the rear. And then if you can figure out what side it is, that helps you too. And it maybe sounded a little bit on the left side, but a lot of times the noise just drones, you can't tell. So, but when you're test driving, just try to figure out if it's front, rear, left, right, and then you can use that information in the second step, which is pinpointing exactly which bearing is bad. Definitely the worst thing for a bad wheel bearing that's making noise is to drive at long distances at high speeds. That's where you can really get into trouble. Once the airflow over the vehicle becomes greater, it's harder to hear the noise. So just because you can drive faster and the wheel bearing doesn't sound as loud, that doesn't mean it's okay. That's the worst thing you can do for a noisy wheel bearing. It's trying to tell you something. I would recommend, if you do hear noise from your bearing, just to drive it home, drive it to a shop, plan the repair, and do it immediately. I've been like dead wrong thinking I had a front right wheel bearing, and then I got to this point where I was going to shake and spin it down, and I was glad I did because I shook it down, found a loose wheel bearing and a loud wheel bearing, totally different spot than the right front. So had I replaced that right front, then I would have test drove it after the replacement and I would have had the same exact noise. What you want to do is do what's called a shakedown test. And then you want to follow that up with a spin test. So you want to do that at each wheel. And a shakedown test is essentially shaking a wheel down on its Y and X axis to try to detect any abnormal play in the wheel or tie rod ends or ball joints or the suspension in general. This will usually expose it quite easily. We're going to do a little side-to-side motion here and just try to turn the wheel left and right. You can try big motions if you want. You can try small motions if you want, but usually you detect it with a smaller motion like this. You're looking for a slight amount of play, but I don't feel any play here. And then you want to do top to bottom, and I don't feel any play there. So I would say initially this passes a shakedown test. So now what we need to do is spin test it, and that's pretty easy. Just spin it by hand. And you can spin in either direction. You can go this direction, you can go that direction. It really shouldn't matter. So whichever way you can spin the wheel the fastest is usually the best. Can you hear that little ticking in there? That's just a brake pad ticking the rotor. Pretty quiet. Let's do that on the rest of the 3 wheels. Okay, here's the right front wheel, so we'll shake it down left to right. Top to bottom. I don't feel any play in either direction. So let's give it a spin test. This one's nice and quiet also. I like to check it a couple of times. Okay, this is the right rear wheel, so let's shake it down. Left to right. Top to bottom, it feels nice and tight, so let's give it the spin test. Okay, I definitely hear the bearing on this side. It's actually quiet, but I believe that that side is spinning at the same time. I can hear the bearing on that side growling. Okay, so we're in the left rear bearing. Let's do our shakedown, left to right, top to bottom. I don't feel any play there, so the bearing is tight. Now let's do a spin test. So you should be able to hear that bearing. It's quite loud and very growly. This is obviously the bad wheel bearing. So I'm going to replace just this wheel bearing, and that should take care of our noise while driving. There is more advanced techniques to discover a bad wheel bearing if you have a real stubborn one that's hard to find. But this covers 99% of bad wheel bearings. That is the easiest way to pinpoint a bad wheel bearing. On occasion, there are wheel bearings that are hard to diagnose, and you have to get out a stethoscope and spin test the wheels while on the hoist, or use a chassis ear and spin test them on the road. And it uses a little electrical microphone device with a microphone on each wheel, and that works good too. Those are a little more expensive. If you discover a loose wheel bearing, that's typically your bad bearing. And if you discover a growly bearing by spin testing it, then that's also a bad bearing. I'm back. So I replaced the wheel bearing in here, so I thought I'd do another spin test so you could see the noise difference. It's much, much better. And here is the wheel bearing. You can see all that black grease. It got burned on that side pretty bad. You always want to use high quality parts. You want to use manufacturer parts, or literally the most expensive bearing you could buy is always going to be your best bearing. Typically Timken or Moog is the better aftermarket brands. Factory bearings are always going to be your best bet. Factory meaning OEM or the company that manufactured your car. Cheapest one you can find, those will last 6 to 12 months maximum. You might get lucky and get one that lasts longer, but my experience has been 6 months, maybe a year, and that's about it. So if you like doing it twice, go ahead and use those, but I would highly recommend not doing that and just spend the money. It's a pay me now or pay me later kind of thing. So if you're keeping the vehicle, you should definitely spend the money. I also have videos on press-in style bearings, bolt-in style bearings, trailer bearings, and if you want to check them out, that'd be cool. And if you're new, please subscribe, and see you in the next one.